Citizens recently found plutonium in breathable particles at 2 locations near Rocky Flats. Our small sampling project about the danger of exposure to plutonium concerned just a small group of people that got together and decided that we needed to have a better situation than we have at Rocky Flats. We all know that after completion of the cleanup at Rocky Flats, an unknown quantity of plutonium, much of it in the form of tiny particles, was left behind in the environment at the site. And we also know that plutonium is exceedingly toxic in the form of particles too small to see, but not too small to do harm. Over the last 2 years, government agencies, repeatedly rejected requests that they sample surface dust at Rocky Flats and analyze the samples for their plutonium content. West McKinley suggested we take our own samples. The idea caught on. A little money was raised. I hired Todd Margulis, a local man who's experienced at this kind of work, and on April 14th, he and I collected 4 samples near the Rocky Flat site. The samples were sent for analysis to Marco Kaltofen of the Boston Chemical Data Corporation in Massachusetts. 2 of our samples, he reported back to us, contained plutonium. One of them was collected in open space. There's Todd Margulis working in that open space area where we collected plutonium at the base of yucca plants, about the only loose soil we were able to find at that day. This is right across the street from the Rocky Flat site, right over there on the other side. The other sample that we collected that day that had plutonium in it was crawl space, and here's a picture of Todd Margulis taking the dust under a house in the crawl space in a house that was built near Stanley Lake in 1960. I'm going to talk about these 2 samples. First of all, the open space sample. According to Kaltofen, a small amount of plutonium was found at this location. The land, just to give a bit of history about it, after the cleanup at Rocky Flats, a big portion of the site, about 3/4 of it, roughly 7 square miles, was transferred from the Department of Energy to Fish and Wildlife Service to operate it as a wildlife refuge. And Fish and Wildlife Service had already decided that they would eventually open the wildlife refuge for public recreation. They did this despite the fact that when they did the environmental impact statement on the wildlife refuge, 82% of the commenting public said keep the refuge closed to the public. People who know something about plutonium's danger wondered why take risks? Why play with people's health? Why not, for once, with radioactive material, be cautious rather than careless? EPA and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the 2 government agencies primarily responsible for protecting the public health, gave the plan to open Rocky Flats Wildlife Refuge a green light. They say there's no pathway by which the plutonium that remains in the environment at Rocky Flats can reach visitors to the refuge. Our open space sample shows that there is a pathway. The pathway is one of air transport. What happens is really a mix of burrowing animals, the activity of burrowing animals, and when. At Rocky Flats, a 1996 study showed, and this study has been neglected by EPA and the Colorado Department of Health. A study done at Rocky Flats by an independent scientist named Sean Smallwood showed that there are 18 burrowing animals on the Rocky Flats site. They burrow down to as deep as 16 feet, and they are constantly recirculating the soil and whatever is attached to the soil in that environment. If they bring plutonium and other things to the surface at Rocky Flats where there's strong wind, the wind picks it up and transports it to some other location, such as the one where in an off-site location we found plutonium. The plutonium we found there was probably deposited recently, and it wasn't the product of global fallout according to Caltoffin's analysis. I have a recommendation to make. The government agencies should establish a permanent program at Rocky Flats of testing breathable dust in surface soil for its plutonium content. Wes McKinley will say more about the refuge in a moment, but I want to mention my colleague and friend Harvey Nichols, who was pointed out a moment ago. Harvey, who is a biologist that did studies of airborne radioactive materials in the Rocky Flats environment back in the 1970s. Harvey wants the U.S. Congress to require that DOE Superfund sites like Rocky Flats be kept closed to the public for at least a century after completion of cleanup. This would provide time for long-term effects from radioactive contaminants to be more fully studied. Now I'll say a few things about the second sample, the one collected in crawl space. Caltoffin said that this dust collected under that house, like depicted right there, Todd, in the process of collecting it, this dust contained hot particles with high concentrations of plutonium. A danger, he said, to anyone who spends time in this space. This dust had accumulated under this house for 50 years, since the house was built in 1960. The implication of this sample is that any building in the contaminated area, and more is going to be said about what the contaminated area is in a moment, any building in the contaminated area downwind of Rocky Flats that existed during the production years at the plant is likely to have plutonium in places where dust gathers in that house or other kind of operation going on in that building. Refrigerator coils, ventilation systems, seating fans, etc. Our sample did not include plutonium that was released from Rocky Flats in the single worst release of plutonium in the history of the plant. That is, the fire that happened there in October 1957. Other houses downwind of Rocky Flats that are older than the one where we collected our sample may, in fact, contain some plutonium that was released in that 1957 fire. So far as I know, this project is the very first time indoor dust has ever been sampled in the environment around Rocky Flats, sampled and analyzed for its plutonium content. This has never previously been done in this area. Our small project, sampling project, confirms that Rocky Flats poses a local hazard forever.